The sun, a mere sliver above the tranquil surface of the Bismarck Sea, cast a shimmering reflection as Japanese Colonel Tishi Nakamura surveyed the scene from the deck of the transport vessel, Kios Maru. It was the 3rd day of March, 1943. The fleet, comprising 8 heavily laden transports and their attendant destroyer escorts, was mere hours away from reaching its destination, Lae, New Guinea. Below decks, crammed tightly, were nearly 7,000 Japanese soldiers, critical reinforcements for a garrison already struggling to hold its ground. Colonel Nakamura harbored no apprehension regarding American aerial assaults. After all, what real threat could medium bombers possibly pose to a well-defended convoy at sea? In a matter of hours, he would confront a grim and decisive answer. The colonel was entirely unfamiliar with the tactic known as skip bombing. He had never encountered the formidable 8-gun armament mounted in the nose of a modified B-25 Mitchell bomber, and he certainly could never have envisioned that American ingenuity would transform these standard medium bombers into instruments of maritime destruction, wielding a ferocity previously unseen. This is the account of how American innovation reimagined a conventional medium bomber into a formidable seagoing destroyer, and how a single, decisive engagement irrevocably altered the nature of naval warfare in the Pacific theater. The year 1942 had been an unmitigated disaster for Allied forces across the Pacific. Japanese territorial gains extended from the Aleutian Islands to the Solomons, forging a sprawling dominion that appeared virtually unassailable. In the Southwest Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur's forces desperately clung to precarious toeholds in Australia and New Guinea, while Japanese convoys navigated the surrounding waters with impunity, supplying and bolstering their scattered garrisons. For Lieutenant General George Kenney, the commander of the 5th Air Force, the situation was nothing short of infuriating. His bombers were incapable of inflicting meaningful damage upon the Japanese Navy. Traditional bombing runs from high altitudes against swiftly moving vessels proved utterly futile. Bombs released from an elevation of 20,000 feet afforded enemy captains ample opportunity to steer their ships clear of harm. Even when American bombardiers believed they had achieved a perfect aim, their ordnance would descend harmlessly into the ocean, leaving Japanese destroyers and transports unscathed. The stark arithmetic of aerial combat was brutally simple and profoundly demoralizing. A vessel traveling at 20 knots could traverse nearly 700 feet in the time it took a bomb to fall from a great height. American bomber crews were, in essence, attempting to strike moving targets while blindfolded, a fact the Japanese were keenly aware of. Their convoys proceeded with ever-increasing audacity, confident that American air power posed no substantial risk to well-managed vessels. Kenney recognized the absolute necessity for change. The dense jungle terrain of New Guinea rendered conventional medium-altitude bombing largely ineffective against ground targets. However, it was the maritime war that truly gnawed at him. The Japanese supply lines served as the very lifeblood of their Pacific empire. Sever these arteries, and the entire enemy war machine would inevitably bleed out. But first, American bombers had to master the art of actually striking ships. The solution would emerge from an unexpected quarter: a seasoned former Navy pilot named Paul "Papy" Gunn. Hailing from Arkansas and having spent his formative years in the Philippines, Gunn had endured the Japanese invasion of Manila and witnessed, with profound helplessness, the internment of his wife and children by enemy forces. Now, serving with the Army Air Forces, he carried a personal animosity towards the Japanese that burned with an almost incandescent intensity. More significantly, he possessed the crucial mechanical acumen and innovative spirit that American air power desperately required. Working in tandem with Jack Fox, a field representative for North American aviation, at a dusty airfield in Townsville, Australia, Gunn embarked on a series of experimental modifications to the B-25 Mitchell bomber. The standard aircraft featured only light defensive armament in its transparent nose section, where a bombardier would lie prone, sighting targets through his Norden bomb sight. Gunn, however, envisioned something radically different: a flying gunship bristling with forward-firing machine guns. The initial prototype, though rudimentary, showed considerable promise. Gunn and his team removed the bombardier's station, replacing the clear nose with a solid metal structure housing 4 50-caliber machine guns. Additional guns were fitted in cheek pods mounted on either side of the fuselage. The pilot could now aim the entire aircraft, effectively transforming it into a colossal fighter, capable of unleashing devastating firepower upon surface targets. Yet, the modified B-25 represented only half of the solution. The other crucial element would come from Major William Benn, a former flight instructor who commanded the 63rd Bombardment Squadron. Ben had grown weary of observing his B-17 flying fortresses miss their Japanese targets from high altitudes. If conventional bombing proved ineffective, he reasoned, then conventional bombing must be abandoned entirely. Ben began to experiment with a technique that appeared almost suicidal, approaching enemy vessels at wave-top altitude and releasing bombs designed to skip across the water's surface, much like pebbles tossed by children. While the concept was not entirely novel, the British had explored similar tactics. Ben refined it into a deadly science. By flying at precisely 200 feet above the ocean's surface at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour, a bomber could release its ordnance from a distance of just 300 yards. The bombs would bounce once or twice before striking the target ship's hull below the waterline. This method proved devastatingly effective, but it also entailed immense peril. Ships at such close range could bring their entire complement of anti-aircraft guns to bear on the attacking bombers. Deck crews could clearly discern the eyes of the American pilots as they roared in at mast height. This was precisely where Poppy Gunn's gun-nosed B-25's would prove their indispensable value. As the modified bombers closed on their objectives, they could unleash withering barrages of 50 caliber fire, effectively sweeping enemy decks clear of gunners. The synergy between skip bombing and the gunship concept would transform the North American B-25 Mitchell from a conventional medium bomber into the most feared anti-shipping weapon in the Pacific. Meanwhile, the Japanese remained utterly oblivious to the impending danger. Their naval strategists had studied American bomber tactics and concluded that high-altitude attacks posed minimal risk to maneuvering vessels. They had never anticipated the emergence of the formidable aircraft that Poppy Gunn and his colleagues were meticulously crafting. By the early part of 1943, modified B-25's were emerging from field workshops across the Southwest Pacific. Some were equipped with 4 50 caliber guns in the nose, others carried 6, and a few experimental variants boasted as many as 8 in the nose alone. Further armament was integrated into side pods, dorsal turrets, and waist gun positions. These aerial fortresses could concentrate between 14 and 18 50 caliber machine guns on a single target, a firepower equivalent to that of many destroyers. The industrial might behind this transformation was staggering. Each 50 caliber machine gun weighed 84 pounds, and its ammunition nearly 4 ounces per round. The guns possessed a rate of fire approaching 800 rounds per minute, meaning a single 8-gun nose could theoretically unleash over 6,000 rounds of devastating 50 caliber ammunition per minute. When multiple B-25's attacked in formation, the combined firepower was simply overwhelming. American crews underwent rigorous and relentless training in these new tactics. They practiced skip bombing runs against derelict hulls and stationary targets until they could deliver their bombs with surgical precision. They learned to coordinate their assaults so that multiple aircraft would approach from divergent angles simultaneously, overwhelming enemy defenses. Most crucially, they learned to operate as cohesive units, with some aircraft focusing on suppressing anti-aircraft fire, while others concentrated on delivering the decisive blow. The psychological preparation was as vital as the technical training. Skip bombing demanded that pilots fly directly into the face of enemy defenses, maintaining a steady course and velocity, even as anti-aircraft fire erupted around them. There was no room for hesitation or second-guessing. Once committed to an attack run, pilots had to press home their assault regardless of the opposition. The margin for error was measured in mere seconds and feet. Meanwhile, Japanese naval commanders remained blissfully ignorant of the profound shift occurring in Allied air tactics. Their intelligence reports indicated ineffective high-altitude bombing attacks and the occasional fortunate hit. They possessed no awareness of skip bombing or the devastating capabilities of the modified B-25's. When they planned convoy routes and defensive formations, their calculations were based on outdated assumptions about American capabilities. This intelligence failure would ultimately prove catastrophic. The Japanese military had consistently prided itself on its swift adaptability and innovative tactics. However, in this instance, they were fighting a war that had already been surpassed, while their adversaries were poised to unleash entirely novel forms of combat. The very overconfidence that had served them so well during their initial conquests now blinded them to the approaching storm. Colonel Nakamura, standing on the bridge of the Kios Maru on that March morning, embodied this perilous complacency. An experienced infantry officer who had seen combat in China and the Dutch East Indies, he possessed an intimate understanding of land warfare. Yet, like many Army officers, his knowledge of naval aviation extended little beyond observations made during transport voyages. The infrequent appearance of American bombers at high altitudes had never posed a serious threat to previous convoys. Why should this particular voyage be any different? The colonel's confidence was mirrored by that of the convoy's naval escort commander, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, a seasoned destroyer captain who had honed his skills in the ferocious night battles around Guadalcanal. Kimura's perception of American air power was primarily as a high-altitude annoyance. His 8 destroyers were equipped with formidable anti-aircraft armaments, and his formations were designed to provide overlapping fields of fire against conventional bombing assaults. He had no reason to suspect that American tactics had evolved far beyond anything within his experience. As the convoy proceeded steadily towards Leh, Allied intelligence meticulously tracked its every movement. Australian coast watchers, positioned on Japanese-occupied islands, relayed positional reports, while codebreakers in Melbourne and Washington deciphered Japanese naval communications. The Allies knew the convoy's composition, its intended destination, and its estimated time of arrival. More ominously for the Japanese, they knew precisely when and where to strike. The convoy's sole protection had been the weather. For 3 consecutive days, severe storms had blanketed the Solomon and Bismarck seas, grounding Allied aircraft and providing cover for the Japanese vessels. However, on the 2nd day of March, the skies began to clear, and American reconnaissance planes spotted the convoy steaming southward. The initial attacks commenced that afternoon. Conventional high-altitude bombing runs by B-17 Flying Fortresses, which achieved limited success but served as a clear indication that the Allies were aware of the convoy's presence. That night, as Colonel Nakamura reviewed reports of minor damage sustained during the day's attacks, he was unaware that American and Australian air bases across the region were abuzz with unprecedented activity. Mechanics toiled through the night, preparing modified B-25’s for combat. Ordnance crews loaded thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition and meticulously fused skip bombs for the forthcoming morning assault. Pilots studied identification charts and memorized attack profiles that would bring them within point-blank range of enemy ships. The most critical preparation was psychological. The crews of the gunship B-25’s understood they were about to undertake an operation of a scale never before attempted. They would be flying into heavily defended airspace at altitudes where every enemy weapon could reach them. Success would demand split-second timing, unwavering nerves, and absolute commitment to the attack, irrespective of potential casualties. Some crew members penned final letters to their loved ones. Others meticulously cleaned their weapons one last time or gazed at photographs of wives and children they might never see again. The veterans among them knew that the mission ahead would be unlike anything they had previously experienced. This would not be a matter of releasing bombs from a comfortable altitude and returning home. This would be warfare conducted at knife-fighting range, where survival would depend as much on sheer luck as on practiced skill. As dawn broke on the 3rd day of March, 1943, the stage was set for one of the most devastating exhibitions of air power in military history. The Japanese convoy, now less than 100 miles from its objective, continued its confident journey towards Leh. Colonel Nakamura joined fellow officers for breakfast in the transport's cramped wardroom, discussing plans for the efficient offloading of troops and supplies upon reaching port. However, engines were already roaring to life at Allied airfields across the region. Modified B-25’s taxied towards runways, their pilots testing controls and conducting final checks of weapon systems. The 8-gun nose, destined to define this battle, was about to be revealed to an enemy utterly unprepared for its destructive potential. In a mere few hours, Colonel Nakamura would witness a complete metamorphosis in aerial warfare. The conventional tactics he understood would prove entirely inadequate against weapons and methodologies that existed solely within the nightmarish visions of naval officers. The Japanese convoy was sailing directly into a revolution in military technology, and there would be no escape. Precisely at 10:15 on the morning of the third day of March, 1943, Colonel Nakamura was reviewing transport manifests when the initial air raid sirens began to wail across the convoy. On the horizon, tiny specks rapidly grew larger. These were not the high-flying B-17's to which the Japanese had become accustomed. These aircraft were approaching low, skimming just above the wave tops at tremendous speeds. The colonel hurried to the bridge wing and raised his binoculars. What he observed defied everything he understood about American bomber tactics. A formation of twin-engine aircraft was hurtling directly towards the convoy at an altitude that could not have exceeded 50 feet above the water. Even more perplexing, they appeared to be approaching from multiple directions simultaneously, as if engaged in a coordinated, intricate attack pattern. On the destroyer Shirayuki, radar operators frantically relayed ranges and bearings, but the information proved nearly useless. These were not conventional bombing formations approaching from predictable altitudes and headings. These aircraft were flying so low that they barely registered on radar screens, and they moved with such velocity that gun directors could not track them effectively. The initial wave comprised Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters, twin-engine aircraft bristling with cannons and machine guns. They swept across the convoy at mast height, their guns chattering a death knell as they strafed bridge structures and anti-aircraft emplacements. Sailors who, moments before, had been manning deck guns were diving for cover, or lay still where the cannon shells had found them. However, the Beaufighters were merely the opening salvo. Following them came the modified B-25’s, and Colonel Nakamura caught his first glimpse of Papy Gunn's ingenious creation. The nose of the lead Mitchell bomber bore no resemblance to the transparent bombardier stations he knew. Instead, it was a solid mass of metal from which protruded the dark muzzles of multiple 50-caliber machine guns. The pilot of that lead B-25 was Major Edward Lana, a soft-spoken Texan who had dedicated months to perfecting the art of skip bombing. As he lined up his approach on the transport Teo Maru, Lana's thumb hovered over the gun trigger, while his bombardier prepared to release their deadly cargo. The Mitchell was now less than 1,000 yards from the convoy and closing rapidly. What transpired next would be indelibly etched into the memory of every Japanese survivor. Lana's 8 nose-mounted 50-caliber guns opened fire in unison, creating a stream of tracer rounds that appeared to connect his aircraft directly to the enemy vessel. The 50-caliber bullets, each weighing nearly 4 ounces, struck the transport superstructure with devastating force. Bridge windows exploded into a cascade of glass. Anti-aircraft gun crews were swept away like leaves in a hurricane. At precisely 300 yards from the target, Lana's bombardier released 2 500-pound bombs equipped with 4-second delay fuses. The Mitchell's speed carried it directly over the transport, while the bombs skipped across the water like stones hurled by titans. The first bomb impacted Teo Maru's hull just above the waterline, penetrating deep into the vessel before detonating. The second bomb struck slightly aft and exploded below the waterline, creating a massive rupture that immediately began flooding the engine room. Colonel Nakamura watched in stunned disbelief as the Teo Maru began listing heavily to starboard. In less than 30 seconds, a single American bomber had achieved what hours of high-altitude bombing had failed to accomplish. But the nightmare was only just beginning. Following Lana came 11 more B-25's, each bristling with forward-firing guns and carrying ship-killing bombs. The Japanese anti-aircraft gunners, who had survived the initial strafing runs, found themselves facing an insurmountable predicament. The attacking bombers were moving too swiftly and flying too low for conventional anti-aircraft tactics to be effective. Gun crews trained to engage high-altitude formations were suddenly confronted with targets streaking past at eye level. The psychological impact was overwhelming. Many gunners simply froze, unable to comprehend the reality of aircraft attacking from such close proximity. On the destroyer Asashio, Lieutenant Commander Sato shouted orders to his gun crews, but his words were lost amidst the roar of aircraft engines and the thunder of exploding bombs. His ship's primary armament was designed to engage surface targets, not aircraft attacking from wavetop altitude. The smaller anti-aircraft guns could not traverse quickly enough to track targets moving at 300 miles per hour just 50 feet away. The second B-25 in the formation, piloted by Lieutenant Ralph Diallo, selected the transport Kiyosumi Maru as his target. This was Colonel Nakamura's ship, carrying over 800 Japanese soldiers who had never experienced anything remotely like the inferno about to engulf them. Diallo's approach was textbook perfection. His 8 nose guns raked the transport's deck from stern to stern, clearing away anti-aircraft positions and sending troops scrambling for any available cover. The skip bomb attack that followed was devastating in its precision. Diallo's first bomb struck the transport amidships and penetrated to the engine room before detonating. The blast killed dozens of soldiers packed in the lower decks and ruptured the ship's main steam lines. Within minutes, the Kiyos Maru was dead in the water, listing heavily and taking on thousands of tons of seawater. Colonel Nakamura found himself thrown against a bulkhead as the ship lurched violently to port. Emergency lighting flickered on as the main electrical systems failed. From below came the screams of wounded soldiers and the terrifying sound of rushing water. The colonel had served in combat for over a decade, but nothing had prepared him for this. American bombers had just demonstrated a level of precision and firepower that seemed almost supernatural. The assault continued with relentless efficiency. Each B-25 selected its target and executed the same deadly routine. Approach at wave-top altitude while raking the enemy vessel with concentrated machine gun fire, then skip-bomb the target before climbing away to safety. The Japanese convoy, which had steamed confidently towards Leh mere hours before, was being systematically annihilated by tactics they had never encountered and weapons they could not effectively counter. Transport after transport succumbed to the devastating combination of strafing and skip bombing. The Teiyo Maru rolled over and sank within 20 minutes of being struck. The Nojima Maru was split asunder after sustaining 3 direct impacts. The Kembu Maru was engulfed in flames, a furious inferno fueled by secondary detonations of aviation fuel. What had been a meticulously planned reinforcement operation was rapidly devolving into a naval catastrophe of unparalleled magnitude. The captains of the escorting destroyers, striving to reposition their vessels for improved anti-aircraft defense, found themselves engaged in a chaotic, multi-directional struggle for which they possessed no prior training. American bombers assaulted from an array of altitudes and vectors simultaneously. High above, B-17 flying fortresses persisted with their conventional bombing runs, compelling the destroyers to maintain their anti-aircraft formations. At sea level, modified B-25's executed their skip-bombing assaults with chilling accuracy. Captain Har of the destroyer Tokitsukaze attempted to ram an oncoming B-25, steering his vessel directly into the bomber's flight path. However, Lieutenant Bill Allen, at the controls of his Mitchell bomber, simply ascended at the last possible moment, clearing the destroyer's upper structure by less than 10 feet. As he soared over the ship, Allen's dorsal gunner unleashed a torrent of sustained .50 caliber rounds upon the destroyer's bridge, claiming the lives of several officers and grievously wounding Captain Har himself. The psychological toll on the Japanese crews proved as devastating as the physical destruction. These were seasoned mariners, veterans of some of the war's most brutal naval engagements, yet they had never encountered anything akin to the modified B-25's. The spectacle of American bombers descending to mast height, their bombardier compartments ablaze with machine gun fire, was utterly terrifying. Many Japanese sailors would later recount their encounters with the attacking Mitchells, describing them as fire-breathing leviathans that seemed to rise directly from the ocean's surface. By midday, all 8 Japanese transports were either submerged or rapidly sinking. The destroyer Asashio, severely damaged by relentless bombing assaults, was barely functional and would succumb before the day concluded. The Tokitsukaze had absorbed a direct hit from a skip bomb, leading to a catastrophic flooding of its forward compartments. The Shiryuki was consumed by fire from bow to stern, having been struck by incendiary ordnance. Only 4 destroyers remained combat-ready, and their crews were desperately engaged in the grim task of plucking survivors from the water. Colonel Nakamura found himself adrift, clinging to debris in the oil-slicked expanse of the Bismarck Sea. The Kiyosumi Maru had gone down less than an hour after the initial assault, taking hundreds of soldiers to their watery graves. Around him bobbed the scattered remnants of what was meant to be a pivotal reinforcement mission. Wooden crates, life preservers, and the bodies of soldiers drifted amidst the gentle swells, while overhead, American aircraft circled like predatory sharks. The most harrowing phase of the engagement was yet to unfold. Allied aircraft began methodically targeting Japanese survivors floundering in the water, as well as the destroyers attempting their rescue. This was not an act of random brutality, but a calculated strategic maneuver. Every soldier who managed to reach land would, within days, become an enemy combatant armed with a rifle. Every sailor rescued could potentially man another warship in future conflicts. From a purely military perspective, the decision to attack survivors was cold and logical, yet it would forever haunt the consciences of many Allied airmen. Lieutenant Robert Rugg, piloting a B-25 christened Heaven Can Wait, recorded in his diary that engaging men in the water was the most arduous order he had ever received. Nevertheless, directives were to be followed, and the strategic imperative was undeniable. Throughout their conquest of the Pacific, the Japanese had demonstrated no clemency towards Allied prisoners or civilian populations. This was total war, a brutal reality where the conventions of chivalry had long since been discarded. The final accounting of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was staggering. All 8 Japanese transports had been sunk, along with 4 of their 8 escorting destroyers. Of the nearly 7,000 troops who had embarked from Rabaul, fewer than 1,300 would ever reach New Guinea. The vast majority had perished, either drowning with their vessels or falling victim to the subsequent attacks on those struggling in the sea. Japanese casualties numbered over 3,000 killed, while Allied losses were confined to a mere 13 aircrew members. For Colonel Nakamura, adrift amidst the wreckage of his convoy, the battle signified more than a mere military defeat. It represented a profound realization about the evolving nature of warfare itself. The Japanese military had taken immense pride in its rapid adaptability and innovative strategies, yet it was utterly unprepared for the revolution in aerial combat that had just unfolded before its eyes. The 8-gun nose of the B-25 Mitchell had emerged as a harbinger of innovation. The synergy of concentrated firepower and skip-bombing techniques had transformed medium bombers into exceptionally effective anti-shipping platforms. More significantly, it showcased American industrial prowess and tactical agility in ways that would fundamentally redefine the entire Pacific War. The psychological ramifications extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. News of the calamity spread with alarming speed through the Japanese military command structure, reaching even the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. The notion that American bombers could systematically obliterate entire convoys deeply unsettled officers whose strategic planning relied on assumptions regarding the limitations of Allied air power. Emperor Hirohito himself was apprised of the battle and its broader implications. While the loss of so many troops and vessels was grave, the tactical revolution demonstrated by the Allies was even more disquieting. If American bombers could achieve such devastating efficacy against heavily defended convoys, what did this portend for Japan's capacity to maintain its vast Pacific empire? The answer would become starkly apparent in the ensuing months. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked the cessation of Japanese attempts to reinforce their New Guinea garrisons by sea. Henceforth, they would be compelled to depend on submarines and swift destroyer runs under the cloak of darkness. The grand maritime routes that had sustained their Pacific conquests had now transformed into deadly traps, patrolled by modified B-25's boasting their formidable 8-gun noses. American production of gunship variants experienced a dramatic escalation following the battle. The North American Aviation Plant in Englewood, California, commenced manufacturing B-25J models equipped with factory-installed 8-gun noses specifically engineered for anti-shipping missions. These aircraft, officially classified as Strafer variants, would become the bane of Japanese shipping throughout the Pacific theater. The tactical doctrine developed in the aftermath of the Bismarck Sea battle would be meticulously studied and refined throughout the remainder of the war. Skip bombing became standard operating procedure for medium bombers operating against maritime targets. The concept of concentrated firepower, pioneered by Pappy Gunn, was expanded to encompass other aircraft types, including the Douglas A-20 Havoc and, subsequently, the A-26 Invader. Colonel Nakamura, among the fortunate few who survived the engagement and was eventually rescued by a Japanese submarine, dedicated the remainder of the war to developing countermeasures against Allied skip bombing tactics. His reports to headquarters underscored the critical importance of anti-aircraft gun placement and crew proficiency in close-quarters engagements. Nevertheless, the fundamental challenge remained unresolved. Vessels were simply too susceptible to aircraft approaching at wave-top altitude, armed with concentrated firepower. The strategic consequences of the battle's tactical innovations were profound. The annihilation of the Kure convoy signaled the beginning of the end for Japanese dominion over New Guinea. Bereft of reinforcements and vital supplies, the scattered garrisons began to dwindle under relentless Allied pressure. Within months, American and Australian forces initiated their inexorable advance along the coast, supported by the very same modified B-25’s that had proven so destructive in the Bismarck Sea. The legend of the 8-gun nose grew with each successful sortie. Japanese sailors began referring to the modified B-25’s as flying destroyers, and developed a near-superstitious dread of their approach. The psychological advantage was immense. Enemy vessels would frequently break formation and attempt to flee at the mere sight of approaching Mitchells, even when possessing sufficient defensive armament to mount an effective counterattack. By the war's conclusion, modified B-25’s had sunk or disabled hundreds of Japanese vessels across the Pacific. The 8-gun nose had evolved from Papygun's rudimentary field modification into a sophisticated weapon system capable of engaging multiple targets concurrently. Certain late-war variants were outfitted with as many as 1850 caliber machine guns in various positions, rendering them the most heavily armed bombers ever constructed. The human toll exacted by this innovation was measured not only in enemy casualties, but also in the psychological burden placed upon Allied air crews. Undertaking skip-bombing missions demanded a unique brand of valor. Pilots were compelled to press their attacks to point-blank range, frequently navigating through barrages of anti-aircraft fire while maintaining the steady trajectory and velocity essential for precise bomb delivery. Many aircrew members completed their combat tours only to find themselves unable to fully reintegrate into civilian life, having been profoundly affected by the intensity of close-range aerial combat. Colonel Nakamura survived the war and eventually returned to Japan, where he held various administrative posts during the nation's post-war reconstruction. In his memoirs, published decades later, he expounded at length on the Battle of the Bismarck Sea and its impact on Japanese military thinking. He attributed the devastating efficacy of the modified B-25’s with fundamentally reshaping Japanese naval tactics and contributing significantly to their ultimate defeat. The 8-gun nose of the B-25, Mitchell had achieved what conventional weaponry could not. It had rendered ships obsolete as secure conduits for transportation in contested waters. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical devastation. Japanese commanders could no longer presume that well-escorted convoys would reach their destinations with impunity. Every voyage devolved into a perilous gamble against increasingly sophisticated Allied air power. Within the broader narrative of the Second World War, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented a pivotal turning point in the dynamic interplay between air power and naval warfare. The era of the battleship was drawing to a close, ushering in the age of aircraft carriers and land-based bombers. The 8-gun nose stood as both a symbol and an instrument of this transformation, a testament to American industrial ingenuity and tactical innovation born of desperate military necessity. Today, military historians examine the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as a quintessential illustration of how technological advancement can swiftly alter the balance of power in conflict. The confluence of skip-bombing tactics and concentrated firepower forged a revolutionary weapon system that irrevocably reshaped the strategic landscape of the Pacific War. Colonel Nakamura's ill-fated convoy had sailed directly into a new epoch of warfare, and escape from the devastating reality of American ingenuity unleashed in the service of total war was impossible. The 8-gun nose of the B-25 Mitchell had conclusively demonstrated that in modern warfare, innovation and adaptability could be as decisive as sheer numbers or conventional strategies. In a mere few hours over the waters of the Bismarck Sea, American air crews had showcased the potency of creative thinking applied to the ancient art of combat. The Japanese colonel, who could never have conceived of such weaponry, had witnessed the future of aerial engagement, and that future belonged to those with the audacity to cast aside conventional wisdom in their pursuit of revolutionary solutions.